This presentation is based around the Retrofit-at-Scale LETI research work. It focuses on how to get energy retrofit into the mass market, the fact we can considerably reduce the cost of doing that, and indeed retrofit in this sense, we're looking at about halving the heat demand of your typical average home. The process we went through to try to identify a new way of doing it involved looking in depth at the inefficiencies of current processes. And we identified new productivity products, processes, which I want to touch on, and also touch on which bits of the current market drivers are having particularly undesirable consequences, and therefore how one potentially starts to manage those. And then ultimately to start talking about how to get critical mass for this change of approach. Very briefly, that's me. I was the workstream leader for LETI, and I must reference here the Sustainable Development Foundation, for whom they provided the facilities for the free download of the document. It's about 200 pages. It covers an awful lot of things, of which I will touch on a number in a certain amount of depth today. Home energy retrofit, a wicked problem. LETI started looking at this 5 years ago and produced their climate emergency retrofit guide, what best practice looks like. A well-received report. Out of that, though, the feedback was, we have a cost issue. Can we afford everybody going best practice, NFIT, so forth and so on? What happens to the mass of the market, in the sense that it's good to see the market leaders and the best practice, the exemplar practice, but ultimately, what does the mass of the market do? And that's where this subsequent work stream was put together, to look at how many, how deep, and at what cost. And here I have to give a very big thank you to a very large work stream, about 80 odd people. We had something like 7 individual sub-work streams looking at building fabric, building systems, costs, because it is so important. Stock model for the UK, looking at how we get to 2050, understanding why the Climate Change Committee advice to government does not major on retrofit, and perhaps most importantly, but certainly a kingpin in all of this, the social aspects of it, because without those being addressed, we're going to hit a brick wall as we end up with pushback. The scale of the issue, if we look at exemplars of various sort and best practice, it's hardly scratching the surface. The warm homes, the social housing decarbonisation fund, once again, good stuff being done, but the scale of it so small compared with the number of homes we've got in the UK that we need to address. We are barely scratching the surface, and therefore the need to develop something which is more portable, both in private sector as well as various public sector and various in between. Retrofit-at-Scale identified a new way of doing things. But the catch is, it has to be integrated at a whole set of different levels. Yes, you've got to work with the householder, you've got to work at the community level. The supply chain needs to look at new products and services, but there's also policy change direction. And just to go into those in a little bit more depth, what we identified is the ability to, as I say, reduce heating bills by 50%. We're looking at a 7-day turnaround, and I'll explain a little more as to why that came about. The 2/3 less cost for doing a deep retrofit, the need to provide performance warranties, because our performance as an industry has not been well regarded by householders and portfolio holders. The community-based, looking at integrated delivery teams, single trusted enablers, single point of responsibility. We identified almost 40% in current costs, which are going to overheads. Therefore, trying to work out how we squeeze out those, and ultimately productivity step change being needed. In products and processes, the idea of how do we introduce mechanical ventilation, heat recovery, whole house, but a simplified form, as opposed to the Rolls-Royce version that the market offers at the moment. We identified the fact that most heat pumps are almost 100% larger than they need to be. We need to understand how we get hot water storage into dwellings without taking space, because to date, most of the heat pump installations have been largely in larger homes where they've got space. They can sacrifice some space. But if you're the average size home, 85, 90 square meters or smaller, the chances are you cannot do that. The idea of how can we better use the infrastructure that's already in the buildings? And then finally, let's see, in policy framework terms, it's no good saying we're going to retrofit 3 times the number of homes. Can we have some money, government? It ain't going to happen. We need to be able to demonstrate how we deliver this without it costing any more for getting us to net zero carbon. And part of this is a switch from less emphasis on energy supply, and more looking at less demand. The idea that if you need less energy, you can therefore pay less for the grid, for example, less capacity. And then we begin to talk about packages for PRS, because policy finds it very difficult to get into that, as well as able to pay, of which there's more detail in the report, and I won't necessarily touch a great deal on today. One of the first things behind this is drivers from residents, from portfolio holders, from householders. Some of the quotes we were getting: I have no spare indoor space, as I mentioned before. The level of disruption is simply not acceptable. The idea of 3 months with periodically specialist trade contractors coming in to do work, and what do you do during that period? Do you shift people out?
Working.
And then we've got the idea that the retrofit offer is too expensive. And we went through all of these kind of issues as drivers, key drivers for developing an alternative approach. And I've put in here one of the key slides. And you'll see, I'll come back to it at various intervals later on. But fundamentally, this is the breakdown of a typical deep green or deep retrofit, looking at a typical cost for reducing your energy use, your heat demand, by about 2/3. And you can see here where most of the money goes. And on the right-hand side, how we managed to identify a way of not needing to do an awful lot of it, doing a lot more light touch, building fabric things, and doing them to complement a simpler way of getting the services into an existing home and upgrading those including the switch to the heat pump. And I show one example. For example, the largest single item is replacing the windows. And yet something like 89% of UK homes already have double glazing. I might not like the look of some of those double glazing, but in energy terms, they're there. And the average life of double glazing is about 35 years. Should we be throwing out double glazing, which isn't at the end of its useful life? So one of the things you'll see is an alternative approach to how we handle glazing, and it essentially refurbishing existing double glazing, for which there is virtually no supply chain in the industry at the moment. And you'll see other things in there. There's an awful lot of mechanical, electrical, and ancillary costs in there, a lot of management, design, supervision, so forth and so on, and some very large chunks of money for insulation. So this began to give us the agenda of where we could potentially save money. And within the report, there's chapter and verse on all the money or the finance side, for which we're very grateful for the LETI volunteers who were from a cost consultancy background. But to step back very slightly, you begin to realize when you look at this with, I suppose one of the things, key things, looking back on it, is LETI workstreams are non-aligned. They're individuals who offer their time voluntarily. We avoided commercial organizations or even sponsorship from people's day jobs. And what we found is answers came out slightly differently, as opposed to someone who installs heat pumps day in, day out, coming in with an agenda, you need more and more and larger heat pumps. We started to get little snippets like, actually, you don't need heat pumps as big, but I can't say that to my boss. He wants to sell as many big heat pumps as he can. And what you find is our industry is structured around commercial benefits of that sort, which aren't necessarily in the best interest of our ultimate client, the building user and the builder owner. On the left, this is illustrative that our productivity has not changed in 25, 30 years, compared with UK as a whole, which hasn't done very well on an international stage, but has improved its productivity, whereas other particular industries in the UK are way ahead of us in increasing their productivity. We are, in effect, still a cottage industry, and somehow we need to work out how to move beyond that. And on the right, this is a classic tool used in other industries, which illustrates how our understanding of cost and quality is in some ways immature. At one end, we'll go passive house. I mean, you get exceptional quality. They check everything. They've got approvals for all the products. You're paying for it. At the other end of the scheme, we do cheap and cheerful. We don't put in a lot of the softer issues. We don't do the QA component. And the result is the costs creep up at the poor end of the quality of the end of the scale, because we've got condensation issues and mold and so forth and so on. The idea of trying to find a sweet point in the middle. Imagine, a Ford Escort as opposed to a BMW. Ford Escort will give you all that you need to do in legal terms and give you the ability to get to A to B and a reasonable level of comfort. We need to understand how to be able to ask for that level of optimum cost quality without having to default to the BMW. Among the other lessons learned, EPCs are not worth the paper they're written on, or the electronic version. This graph is measuring smart meter data, in other words, actual measured energy use versus the predictions on EPCs and RDSAP. We are wasting money on the wrong measures because ultimately EPCs and the underlying data are pointing us in the wrong direction. To give you an idea, another aspect, we're finding a lot of the existing radiators, which are so quickly ripped out and replaced by the heat pump installers. Oh, well, we've got lower temperature. Yes, we have. But actually, most radiators are oversized. How can we make use of that to the extent that we don't need to touch the radiator system? We save the money, we save the embodied carbon and so forth of stripping them out. And this begins to get this equation of how much building fabric first insulation do we need to do? Well, it's not as much as you might think to allow us to be able to simply replace the services simply, easily, cheaply, and at half the heat demand. I said they were oversized. You can read at your leisure a number of the technical reasons, but fundamentally, top right, we were doing advanced dynamic simulation alongside SAP, PHPP, so the passive house model, and MCS, which is the standard method you're supposed to use to standardize a heat pump. And we were finding they're dramatically oversized for a whole set of reasons. Even though they quote the BS, they're actually not up to date on the BS either. So we identified a number of things like this, which the industry's been a little bit resistant to respond to. Mechanical ventilation heat recovery, we found very interesting because the heat recovery is useful, but not a showstopper. But what it does allow you to do is to do an awful lot of very cost-effective air tightness on your building envelope, sealing all those joints, sealing where the surfaces go in and out, and so on. I'll show some more examples, such that you may well end up going below the limit that you're not getting sufficient fresh air into the dwelling. And that fresh air is what should be picking up the moisture to then go out through the extract. And what we identified, that an MVHR whole house recovers, takes out more moisture, reducing the condensation risk. And we also found that the MVHRs on the market in the UK are definitely the Rolls-Royce end of the market. The idea that an MVHR just means to be a heat recovery unit, a fan to put air in, a fan to take air out with the moisture in it, and a couple of filters, actually means you can buy them by the hundreds of thousands for China. Unfortunately, they have focused on driving costs down with a warranty for more like £400, £500 each. Whereas in the UK, the Rolls-Royce versions with summer bypass and automatic controls, changing the speeds and so forth, means that minimum cost £1,600 to £2,000. This just illustrates the fact we have a market which isn't serving the greater demand that we need. We also identified on the back of MVHR that you don't need to lift the floorboards, which is where most of the money, the disruption and the time comes from. We kept most of the ductwork in the hallway of a typical terrace house, for example. We also identified that the summer bypass is of limited value in the UK. Our climate, in summer, a ceiling mounted fan is a fraction of the cost and is easier to retrofit and gives you more cooling than an MVHR ever will. So you begin to find these technical bits beginning to disrupt the kind of messaging we get from the market as a whole. And there was a whole raft of wider grid energy supply side things we also found as part of this holistic view, because we found that heat pumps, the blue lines, if you apply them across the stock, will more than double the capacity you need from the grid. Currently, the grid's the pinky color at the bottom. But it's only needed for a few weeks of the year at that peak. The rest of the time, all that investment in a high capacity grid is not being used. So the idea of investing instead, not in the grid, but using some of that money through eco kind of mechanisms to upgrade, retrofit homes to reduce the heat demand so that you don't need as much capacity on the grid, is what we were looking at for shifting money around so that retrofit of far more homes does not actually cost us any more money. So thinking out of the box, for example, if one of the items we identified was minimizing disruption, trying to reuse existing radiators and the pipe work, so can we therefore take your combi boiler out, of which something like 85% of all homes now have, particularly the smaller ones where most of the problems are, and retrofit? Can we take that boiler out and replace it with a thermal store, a heat battery, which is a phase change material, which stores about 3 times the amount of heat compared with water, so it can come down dramatically in size, such that it could fit into that space. The technology is there. You can buy the products at the moment, but they're floor mounted for larger dwellings. They don't produce a wall mounted one at the moment, and certainly one which isn't sort of module size to sit within kitchen units, for example. But the idea of then on the back of resizing the heat pump, looking at reduced hot water demand using high efficiency, low flow, high efficiency shower heads, you can reduce the volumes down, you can reduce the demand needed from the heat pump so it can become a wall mounted one, not taking that floor area, and hang it outside the wall. And you've even got the old flue hole to take your pipes through, for example, to your new heat pump. So we're trying to address the fact it's beautiful to have the nice kit and the large new room, but that is not going to serve the mass market, and neither is that large outdoor unit. There is a whole list of these kind of components, which I'll leave you to read at your leisure or in the report. But fundamentally, we try to piece these all together to work out the fabric, the systems, the minimum investment of systems, how to make the management of that process more efficient, such that you didn't have to wait a week after the insulation person had finished before the heat pump person turned up. We found that the heat pump person, ventilation person, the insulation person, the retrofit coordinator, and probably someone else all came along and did their own separate surveys of the same house. We should be looking at one person doing a more comprehensive survey, which would be applicable to everybody and used by everybody. That introduces contractual responsibilities, where it therefore means bringing all of those skills, those trades within the same organization, therefore allows a more integrated and coordinated approach. So these are the sorts of typical fabric measures we were looking at. There's, for example, the windows I mentioned. For about 800 quid, you can have all the hinges replaced on all your double glazing to get the gaskets to reseat, which was where most of the air leaks from older or existing glazing, double glazing, was coming from. It is the moving bits which are the weak link, but you can replace those readily for a fraction of the cost, because actually most of the glass and the framing is absolutely fine. The air tightness, looking at the external doors, sealing the services entries, pipes coming in and out of the building. Well, by the time the services guy comes along and drills a hole, there's no one floating around with a mastic sealer. We need to address those sorts of things. Or loft hatches, deep insulation in the roof, because that's a no-brainer. External wall insulation. Did you know the cost of doing the front wall with all the detail around the windows and all the cutting and fitting is about 50% more expensive on the front wall than it is to do the flank wall, which has very little windows? So shouldn't we be focusing in cost effectiveness terms on that flank wall? Not least of all, the front wall is where we were getting social pushback. A lot of people rather like the Victoriana, the terraces, or the planning officers in conservation areas or what have you. It's the front wall which is the important bit. So you pick and choose your fights, not least of all if you're trying to get in and out in 7 days. The last thing you want is a lengthy planning process. But also on the right, the idea of using foamed insulation, which is actually standard fascia board, which is pre-finished as a waterproof layer in the flanks, the reveals of windows in your critical rooms where you've identified there might be a condensation risk. Those are the sorts of things we found to be very effective. And then trying to look at the underfloor. There's about 10 million homes with ventilated cavities. The idea of using remote control spraying on the underside, which you can do 2 or 3 homes in a day if you've got them fairly close by, and you don't have to lift all the floors, you don't have to remove all the furnishings and so forth, for example. So time, it becomes an important judge as to whether a method is most effective in the overall equation, as opposed to the cost of the individual package. And then likewise in the building services terms, I've already touched on the heat pump on the wall, the MVHR, the ventilation system. I've got a number of views here of examples of internal surface-mounted ductwork. This is off-the-shelf rectangular ductwork, and going to air supply nozzles above the doors. You can see in the middle diagram there. So that you use jets to push the air over to the other side of the room, and then the raw air comes back again. That avoids having to lift any floors and put any of the ducts within the floors. But what we did find, every home in the UK should have 10mm gaps below the doors for the ventilation, whether it's trickle ventilators, mechanical extract, or MVHR, to allow the air to move from air supply rooms with air supply into those where there's extract, kitchens, bathrooms, so forth and so on. There isn't any tools for cutting that 10mm off the bottom of the door without taking the whole door off the hinges. In productivity terms, we need things which allow someone to go zoom across the bottom and be able to take the ventilation route back. Is it hardly surprising we got mold and lack of ventilation in our buildings when we don't even have the tools or anyone checking that it's actually done to make sure your ventilation works. Finally, I'm going to move on to some of the process components. I've talked about the overheads, single contractual entity, integrated teams, combining trades surveys, avoiding the downtime between trades, trades arriving with the materials they need. And the 7-day we did critical path analysis to make sure you could organize people in different rooms as you went through that building to make sure that everybody could actually work effectively. But you found also you needed local engagement. You need to be able to identify the workflow of projects so that your heat pump installer knows he's got 2 days there. He's then got 2 days in the next street and 2 days a couple of streets away, that sort of thing. So he's not doing what he currently does, is one heat pump every 2 weeks. If he can do three heat pumps installations in the time he currently has one, he can afford to make them smaller. He can afford to spread his profit component across more projects as opposed to loading each one. So local workforce, managing the trades, also being able to provide guarantees. If you're local, the idea that your performance of your work is going to come up for scrutiny and you get feedback via the local community where someone isn't delivering, this builds confidence in householders and portfolio holders that they can actually commit to these kind of processes. Obviously, past 2035, I said plus because we wanted more site survey to be able to make sure you've got the right measures, smart meter data to identify real energy use, components to be retained. I talked about the radiators, the double glazing, identifying out of scope defects for remedials, also avoiding the slippery slope of, oh yes, we'll rearrange your kitchen while you've the opportunity. Great if you want to do that, but don't expect your energy retrofit to necessarily pay for that. It will piggyback if you're having other works done in your home, and that might be the ideal time to do it. But we find a lot of the industry sliding costs in on the back of an energy retrofit. And keep it simple. I've probably covered most of those things, but avoid the complexity of additional controls, additional stripping out. We weren't proposing any internal wall insulation because it involves stripping the whole house, getting all the furniture out. We wanted to try and retain as much in situ as we possibly could. Then we've come into the policy side of things, and perhaps if people have got particular questions on this, I mentioned a number of these previously, but the idea of we need to pump prime the market to help them identify and develop these simplified systems, the MBHR, the heat pumps. We can barely find any smaller for the current market. So where are they? We know they're produced in other countries. The multi-skill training, then looking at the information consumers need, looking at whole house and whole process, including finance, not just the commercially driven information on single measures. I quote once again, the heat pump manufacturers will give you, suppliers will give you chapter and verse on how to do their bit and the grant for their bit. But do they then look at the fact that a little bit of insulation would allow the sizing of that heat pump to be smaller? One stop shop, looking at local area planning, switching more to retrofit process focus. In other words, how do you muster these teams? How do you integrate a team, a process, a work stream, as opposed to doing bullet points of energy supply? Indeed, unless there's some existing network or it's a new build, it's highly debatable whether heat networks will have a future in retrofit. And yes, there's a whole set of co-benefits on health, fuel poverty and social support. But that isn't the driver we found for looking at a change of way of doing things. Those are co-benefits that come out of the process, which reinforce why we need to move in a certain direction. One slide here. Why is retrofit such a low priority? Having spent a lot of time digging into the Climate Change Committee's recommendations for policy, which government is basically accepting, if you look at the numbers, the graph on the left, retrofit costs you about 3 times, it is 3 times more expensive as saving carbon compared with adding more wind turbines. Hence the importance in government's mind of getting more wind farms offshore, off Scotland and so forth, than doing a great deal more retrofit. This reinforces why we need to pull the cost of retrofit down so that we can compete and say you're getting all of those additional benefits previously mentioned without adding to the cost overall by reducing demand and putting retrofit. And just a nice little statistic, if you look at the cost of getting to zero carbon, which the Climate Change Committee are talking about, is order of magnitude of 1% of GDP between now and 2050. That's for all sectors, so that's transport, industry, energy supply, buildings. Altogether, that cost is about 1% of GDP. That is equivalent to just £36,000 per home if we've got 28 million homes. So the idea of spending 60, 70,000 per home doesn't stack up. There is more cost-effective ways of doing it. And the diagram on the right, the most recent Climate Change Committee's 7th carbon budget, shows only a 10% improvement from recommended by Climate Change Committee. The majority is the switch to heat pumps for someone else to do the decarbonising upstream in the energy pool. But I thought that slide would be useful to understand why we're having to look at things in certain ways and justify the costs and the cost reduction for retrofit. And overall, we therefore got on the right a breakdown of how we ended up assessing how much would be this new basic way of doing retrofit versus best practice, ECB or LETI or exemplar, so Enefit or Energy Strong, and then looking at how all of those get paid for within a budget which does not add to UK's cost of getting to zero carbon. More information in the report on that. So the idea that the policy side of things changes more to demand reduction instead of energy supply, you're just shifting money around. You're looking at various measures to help the market, certain ones for the owner-occupiers, certain for the private rented sector, certain ones for the social sector, for example. So in summary, and I'll finish here, we believe it is possible to halve the heat demand on average across the stock for something of the order of 2/3 of the current cost of doing deep retrofit. An alternative basic whole house approach is needed for the mass market. We need to be able to offer more standardized solutions as opposed to professionals saying every home's different. We need to spend thinking time as professionals looking at bespoke solutions for you. We need to have more standardized solutions, a number of options which we can then start to apply based on generic building types and a good survey. Step change in productivity is absolutely key, but we have to be aware of those people selling stuff who see productivity as selling more stuff. We actually want less stuff from them. And yes, it will take a new take on components, processes, and procurement. The idea it would not cost us any more for UK PLC to get there. Top-down shift in cost where money goes, and a whole raft of householder and wider social benefits. Retrofit-at-Scale explains how this can all be achieved. And with that, thank you for listening. That's the QR code if you, as an alternative to the address below, if you want to download your copy of the report. At which point, hand back to Nicola for Q&A. Thank you.
Hello, Chris. Hello, everybody. Thank you so very, very much. Just to say that that was, in terms of, by comparison to the first session, that was very much in depth in terms of the finances and the technical specifications. So for those who really want to look at everything in terms of first, second session, that is greatly helpful as a compendium accompaniment to the download and so on. Okay, so what we're going to do right now is obviously pass around for questions, and I'm simply just going to, so thank you very much, Chris. Thank you.
Okay, no problems, no problems. I see Peter's got a couple of messages in there. I haven't read them yet, but obviously some questions lined up.
Excellent. And in terms of the PDF, the PowerPoint for today's presentation, I will also send that via the networks and so on, and it will be in a download in the video description. Let's start off. Who would, I'll obviously just like to share the question time around. Who would like to start with any questions? You can unmute yourselves happily.
I was going to say if anybody else wanted to go first, because it's about 20 questions if you give me time.
Okay.
One of the things I've been following is the new roles in the passive house coordinator roles. Are those mainly being run by sort of the installation companies? Because you've mentioned in your things sell less stuff. I'm concerned that those people are going to be trying to sell your stuff even though they're meant to be independent.
This is, you say passive house coordinator or retrofit?
Oh, sorry, the retrofit coordinator.
So
yeah, because there's about 5 new roles, aren't there? Yeah.
Past 2035,
yeah,
retrofit coordinator should not be in the pocket of the insulation suppliers or anyone else. One has to say.
They're meant to be truly independent
And
advisors.
indeed, I would think the idea of local authorities taking a role in being able to identify local retrofit coordinators who can be one step removed from the integrated team doing the delivery, because you want the recommendations not to feed into the supply chain, as you are implying.
Yeah, okay, that's better than I thought then.
Diane.
Yeah, there was one thought that all the way through I was having. If I was younger, I would have. In fact, I will watch it again and take notes and do the thing that I can see is required, because there are certainly two, and possibly three, as you said, gaps in the market. That if you are a young entrepreneur kind of person, or somebody, for example, my brother has actually tried doing stuff with his house, and then not being able to get people to do the work and all sorts of other issues. Yeah, exactly. But whereas his son-in-law is actually a heating installer, so he could look at that and find a couple of things like the tool that you said about cutting a piece off the door to put the gap. You know, there are some simple things that we as a society could invent.
I absolutely agree. What I would say is the heating engineer side of things, because I come from a services background, they have so much potential work installing heat pumps. They don't need to consider reviewing it, but absolutely finding people who've got that entrepreneurial spirit to find a new way which the big boys haven't looked at. What I would say is the idea of local authorities or other organizations clustering together to try and trial some of these things and apply for grant funding for innovation from Innovate UK or what have you, for some of these things, in association with people who want to pick up and run with them. Because I don't like the idea of shipping in containers worth of stuff from China. I know they're very good if you get the QA right. They've done iPhones galore up to decent quality. And I lived and worked out there for 3 years. So I know what they can do. But the idea that we could produce them in the UK, we need jobs and potential here. But what we wanted to do was make sure it was technically possible. Where's it done? Oh, right, it's been done out there. But, there's a discussion for another day, but there's a lot of potential in that direction.
Absolutely, absolutely. And consequently, are we allowed to share when you send the recording through, can we share it?
Yes, absolutely. LETI or LETI stuff was all free to download, free to publish, and it's all volunteers giving their time and so forth and so on. So yes.
Perfect, lovely.
Please forgive me. Sorry, I would just before Seneca comes in. All of the videos are completely in the public domain. Chris Twinn now has the Twin Sustainability Innovation YouTube, and everything is shared on there, 100% publicly open access for all. I'm going to pass to Seneca. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
After you, can we go to Peter? But yes, absolutely. Carry on.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, Chris, for your presentation. Very useful. I was just wondering, would you know anyone who would be interested in following a family or a project of someone trying to retrofit their houses, a range of houses from like a terrace to a semi-detached, etc., and then having someone like Channel 4 or Sky Arts follow that whole process, and then once it's filmed, it's there on YouTube.
I've no problems with that. I'm not sure I can immediately put my finger on someone who'd be able to do that, but we can certainly sort of wider inquiries in that. What I would say is I think we're a little bit earlier in this process. We need to work out how we can get these products and processes up and running, and then highlight good practice, as opposed to necessarily showing us falling flat on our faces because we can't quite get all the products there or what have you. But absolutely agree that we need to get to the point you're talking about a bit to be able to disseminate best practice. Peter, can you unmute and so on? You say you're a heating service engineer, impression that radiators are often undersized, over-optimistic, manufacturers' claims. I would point you to government research, which shows generally they are oversized. Okay. Typically, a heating engineer, installer, passes through the cost to the householder anyway. And it doesn't want to be caught short, and he will go down and see which ones he's got available, round the size up to the next size and what have you. But that's where the survey needs to be able to identify exactly what is installed, because that then defines how much the fabric enhancement needs to be in those rooms. for example. So there's a valid point there.
Can I ask, is this government survey on private domestic properties, or is it on social housing or large schemes? Because I don't know, my impression on domestic quotes is that installers give a whole, they're asked to put in a heating installation, and the customer is not very technically savvy, and they go for the cheapest. And so the installers want to get the business by putting in the lowest quotes.
But they don't want to be called back if the rooms are cold. But absolutely, I'm sure there are different circumstances, but it illustrates the fragility of our industry and the need to professionalize it more and provide this integrated single point of service to the occupier stroke property owner, as you say, because we've just slipped into a cottage industry way of doing things. You say regarding double glazing, should old double glazing whose units have aluminium spacers be replaced? Yes, they do let more heat out. However, if you look at the cost of the energy that goes out, it is tiny compared with the cost of replacing all the glazing. So I've got here double glazing that I have put in 25 years ago. I've replaced 2 or 3 panes where the seals are gone, and you're absolutely right, they've got warm spaces, but the others you hardly notice. In the bathroom, you might notice the condensation lingering around the edge of the glass slightly longer, but once again, the amount of energy involved in that compared with the whole building is fairly modest. Certainly, if anyone's got glazing which is coming to the end of its design life, one will recommend, as you say, warm spaces, arguably looking at triple glazing, but one step at a time.
Fine, thanks.
Let's see. Chris, could you be our Kevin McLeod and follow projects? Well, if Channel 4 would employ me. Anyway, Charlie, I think you're next.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, that's a really good idea, actually, because I think what Seneca was saying is that you come across, you make it very clear, Chris. Okay. I have to say, I've been in the industry, I've been developing in London for decades now, and I got really involved in the climate crisis and retrofit when one of our developments flooded out in the July 2021, freak floods where Westminster was impacted more than anywhere else in the UK. And because of the planning regulations, we weren't able to put in a second overflow pipe onto the flat roof of the 5th floor because the council deemed that to actually be a second overflow to be aesthetically not pleasing in a grade 2 listed building. So we had to rely on the Victorian pipes actually in the building, which of course got overwhelmed, and we caused us hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of damage. I then got involved actually in the local neighbourhood forum. We're now looking to produce our own easy to read and understand retrofit guides. I've just downloaded the Retrofit-at-Scale, but I guess what I'm trying to come to, Chris, is that just like Seneca's saying, I've been in it for a long time. I find it really hard to follow all of this, all the acronyms. You talk about the heat loss calculations, the MSC, the PHPP, the SAP, the DSM, the MVHR. It's complicated stuff for people to get their head around. And I think that it would be really helpful if there were a lot more, like a ton more videos available for people. The Retrofit-at-Scale, which you've just explained so eloquently, that should have a video beside it on the council or wherever it's going to appear, so that people can see that part of it easier. You don't have to read 160, it's 168 pages. I just read it. And I'm reading loads of those documents at the moment, which are all 168 pages. And frankly, it's overwhelming.
It is.
So that's my first point. I do think that education is absolutely key here for people at various different levels. And frankly, since I've been involved in this since July 2021, that nobody seems to be educated about either climate resilience, retrofit. People don't know, they've no idea what it really means. It's down on their priority list because obviously people don't want to, if they're going to spend 35 grand, which is the average cost of things, they'd rather spend it for their holiday in Thailand.
Interestingly, we were finding for end of terrace, and okay, this is 2022 costs, we were about 18,000, including the heat pump.
Oh, well, great. Yeah, that's
now allowing for that, industry costs have probably gone up 20%, 25% since then, but it was cheaper than the average cost of a second-hand car in the UK. Those are the arguments somehow we need to be able to put over, that the scale of the cost reduction we need to achieve to make this appealing.
Those are the points I was trying to make, is shift in mindset, just collectively, all of us really, unless we've been impacted, but directly like me, people don't really think about it. So shift in mindset, increase in education. Obviously, we need a skilled labour force. Great that the government last week decided to be able to ramp that up to 18,000 professionals and ramp up the funding. And also, I think planning advice. I mean, all the councils in London have declared climate emergencies. It doesn't feel like an emergency to me. I mean,
I think absolutely right. Moving on, Bridget.
Oh,
Hi.
Hi. I'll try and get my video going as well.
Okay.
Oh, there we go.
Excellent.
I work for Action Empty Homes, and past 9 years we've been working with communities who are renovating empty homes to bring them into use as affordable housing. Over the last 3 years, we've added retrofit into that mix. So communities we work with a small number across the north of England who are retrofitting as they renovate empty homes and providing on-site training for local people. And the aim really is, apart from providing affordable housing and addressing fuel poverty, is to provide exemplars of, within the community that people can see and go and have a poke around in and ask questions and, what are you doing there? To try and demystify retrofit, and also to try to help to build the demand in the area, and by doing so, because it's all community led, shift the economy slightly so that it's more geared around retrofit sustainability, local communities being in a bit more of a driving seat. And I have to say, I found your publication really inspirational, because I think it shows that there is a pragmatic way forward with this. The properties that communities we work with tend to be in pretty poor condition. So the huge cost that gets all muddled up with retrofit is actually renovation.
Absolutely.
So what we try to do is to say, no, you need to separate out what is the retrofit cost and what's the actual renovation cost. And I think the guide that you've presented in the costings is a really good hands-on way of being able to illustrate that. And that there are ways that you can just, okay, let's do a basic one, because that will make a huge difference to you.
Yeah.
If you can't afford to heat your house properly, or if you're wasting heat, then that makes a big difference. And also, I'm totally on board with the idea that, a lot of the energy, or green energy that's generated in the UK is actually wasted.
Well,
they can't transport it. So you know, let's not focus so much on the green alternatives. Let's look at reducing demand, and in that process, really rebuilding communities.
Yeah.
So, you know,
absolutely.
I'm a very positive.
Thank you for your word, and spread the word.
Will do. I'm already sending it out.
Thank you. Let's see, Pete.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, and it's lovely to see you in person. Well, not quite in person, but on screen. I read the report and I was really, really impressed. I've been trying to solve the problems. I'm a former Green Party councillor in Lambeth, and we declared the first climate emergency in Lambeth. And as a councillor, I was trying to work with the Director of Housing to retrofit all homes in the borough. You know, that was the remit was to make Lambeth net zero by 2030, and we are so far away from that. I think one of the biggest challenges will be the political one and the corporate interests who really don't really want to do this. Kind of what I wanted to know was, you know, we do need exemplars, but we need kind of big exemplars, because this is retrofitting at scale, and for it to work, it's got to be at scale. So you can't just do a trial somewhere, and how do you prove that? And so what I was wondering was, can we look at, if we've not got the political will in this country, could we look at somewhere else, or can we find a borough council that would be interested, and could somehow I help to find that council, or Nicola, who I know has done a lot of work with looking at housing strategies for different boroughs. What can we do to kind of pull that together and then get the campaigns? And finally, sorry, is I think we need the political will, but also we're going to need a push from the bottom up, and we need to like Insulate Britain or an organisation like that to actually make some publicity around it to really kick things off. And what are your thoughts on all of that?
You've covered a lot, and I absolutely understand where you're coming from. Because the kind of solutions we identified and others have identified are more localized, I think the idea of selling this is, oh, well, we've got to do it at scale across the country, or, you know, you can imagine Westminster coming up with a directive which says we're going to do this and we're going to put a little bit of money behind it, and that money disappears on the consultants before it's even got to the coalface. Sorry, I've spent 45 years as a consultant. But the idea of a cluster of boroughs with the odd housing association getting together to initiate a demonstration, to identify where the issues are, to try and attract, as I mentioned earlier, innovation funding. And it needs people with the credibility of local authorities to be able to do that. But you're absolutely right. It needs the bottom-up support from not only communities who are interested in doing this. So you're trying to find a neighbourhood plan area which has started to think about these sorts of things, looking at people who want it done to them, as well as the people who are in the process of delivering it. I think it's getting that as a sort of some kind of critical mass to be able to then start to look at that innovation funding, which it will initially need to work out where these bits of kit come from, how you structure a contract for all these different professionals, trade contractors and so forth to be part of. I think that's where I see the way forward. So I think very much overlapping with the sort of things you seem to be saying.
Can I just jump in with a point on Pete's question? Leicester a few years ago did a project where they went around with thermal imaging cameras street by street, showed all the residents photographs of their properties, and then came along with the street by street insulation campaign. So I don't know if anybody's done that since, but might want to get in touch with Leicester and see if they're still doing that kind of thing. Yeah.
Trying
to find an authority.
Yeah, I've seen. I keep tabs on my professional institution and various conferences like Future Build and so forth. And there's been a whole raft of new startups who think that drones with a camera are great, different kinds of camera. And they go down the street and they tell you the profile of what kind of building it is. But one thing we have found from smart meter data is apparently identical, say 1905 terraces have been changed fairly dramatically inside. Most of them have a level of air tightness because people don't like drafts. Therefore, it doesn't reflect the original building, which is one of the reasons why there's condensation issues now. But what people have done inside the houses, inside the fabric, the lean-tos at the back, the added bits and so forth of different standards at different ages. So although the flyby zone, you know, with flyby photo surveys gives useful initial information, and the UCL people trying to link energy bills against them, which we're not allowed to see because it's private data. But there is people beginning to put some of this together. Gives us the first steps, but probably not enough to be able to say, well, that double glazing system has another 15 years in it. We don't need to touch that for now, or that sort of thing. And we want to be able to find in our survey where the air leaks are. So that when your tradesmen go in, they know exactly where they're plugging the leaks. They know there's a gaping hole below the bath because someone didn't bother to seal things up behind, for example. So they're not having to come with a whole load of what if materials and finding they have to spend another 2 days on site because they didn't realise they hadn't investigated the building adequately. But so step in the right direction. We need to do that. But I would also move on that once you bring all the surveys from the specialist trade contractors together into one person, they've got more money to spend on more automated ways of doing it. The idea of doing a LiDAR scan of every room. So you've dimensionally got every room and photographically looked at in each of the surfaces. A thermal imaging on each of the surfaces, done all from something which flies into that room and then flies on to the next room. Boy, is that technology which is here, but it's just not adapted for our industry yet, I would suggest. So good ideas. Georgina.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. It's something I talked about at the last session with you. You're kind of looking to, it's a good idea what you said about trying to bring councils together to look at a way of having like an exemplar estate retrofitted, for example. And this is where I know Pete's on the call. My wits end at how to even communicate with our local councillors in Lambeth because they just totally ignore you. I again invited the people who will be in charge of supposedly, if it comes, putting in double glazing on our estate. We're still single glazing on our blocks. And I've invited them twice to this meeting with you. They haven't turned up. It's like, how do you actually engage with councillors and actually get a sense that they will listen? And it just seems so frustrating to me that at the moment we have estates which are sitting near empty. They're still saying they want to demolish them. And at least one of them, if they were bold, they could use it as an exemplar estate. While it's near empty, it can be retrofitted more effectively, more cheaply, all the rest of it. And they would actually end up with more council housing rather than demolishing and ending up with less. There's an estate near me which I was telling you about.
Yeah.
So yeah, how on earth do we persuade them to do this shift? I mean, the idea that I put forward with I had a petition about trying to use this estate near me as an exemplar estate to train up their own in-house team of retrofitters. This would be bringing together the skills under their noses, so to speak. At the moment, I feel that they're being taken advantage of because they're not even being given the full range of retrofitting options when they're looking at places. They're just using what a particular company does. So that's hamstringing them. Yeah, that's it. I was really interested in what Brigitte was saying, if that's how I've pronounced your name correctly. I'd like to talk to you more about your work, if you'd be so kind as to contact me. Georgina, I've put my email in the chat. Thank you.
Okay, the more we can disseminate good practice for trying to influence people, the better. I readily acknowledge the challenges you've got.
So mine was, I noticed in one of your slides you'd put about reducing the costs of by 40%. I don't know if it was reducing the profit by 40%, but by using
Overheads,
community.
40.
Yeah, the overheads.
Yes.
And it was to use community. Are you talking there where you sort of train up community assessors or organising the work or even doing the work as a community rather than bringing in professionals or something like that?
No, this was simply because unproductive time. And then unproductive use of materials and the amount of supervision, how many times you go and visit the works to check it's being done properly. If you can reduce from 3 months down to 1 week, the amount of time you have to have your portable toilets on site or your scaffolding on site, all of these things tend to be time-based. The number of visits by your retrofit assessor or what have you, if you can do it all in a week, you dramatic. So we have not saved money by reducing the costs for individual people.
Yeah, so what you're talking about is by scaling up to community, you can have them working in an area, and when he's finished one job, he's only going to go 2 doors
Absolutely,
down,
as
rather
opposed
than
to
20 miles away.
Precisely. Yeah. He doesn't know the local wholesalers. Yeah. Therefore, he's run out of this, that, and the other, and he spends half a day down there as opposed to he can pick up on the way in.
Yeah, got you.
Yeah. So, in a sense, that's the emphasis. We haven't cut the costs on anyone's pay for any role. It is generally reduce the time they have to spend.
So organisational improvement.
That's it. That's it. Yeah. That's it. That's what I see as productivity improvement, as opposed to screwing down salaries.
Right. Sorry. Just a real quickie. I've just put in the chat a link to the 89% campaign. Just talking about media. This is a journalists campaign around the fact that 89% of people are really concerned about climate change and want governments to do more, but they believe themselves to be the minority. So, if you want to, it might be worth trying to put your work in front of the 89% campaign, because I feel it's on a similar level. It's like people want to do something. This is what they can do.
Yeah, it's not as difficult as people might think.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's that is probably one of the most important messages we can get out at this time, is that it's not impossible. You can do it.
Yeah. Even if we need to try and get our industry to up its game.
But they will only up their game when they
When there's
feel
demand.
the government has messed them around so much.
Absolutely, absolutely.
The whole
stop-go,
top-down
stop-go.
approach, that's why we work with communities, because the top-down approach, they just put the money to E.ON, you know, who don't have that local infrastructure. What we need to build is the infrastructure at the local level, because that's where the economy is, that's where the demand is, that's where we can generate supply and that kind of thing.
I would very much agree. I would preface that by saying the private rented sector has been an incredibly difficult one to approach locally as much as centrally. The idea that energy companies which have a contractual relationship with a landlord stroke tenant have the ability to potentially redirect some of their money saved by not having to pay for the extra grid capacity, instead using Eco 7 or whatever you might like to call it, to help fund private rented sector. Because I must admit, I'm not sure I have a great deal of confidence, even with the current government upping the limit as to how much landlords ought to spend. I don't think many landlords will end up spending. If anything, dare I say, they'll spend it on consultants to justify why they don't need to do it.
Yeah, probably right. Yeah.
But it does mean we'll need a multitude of different approaches.
Yeah.
With a mixture of some of them being top down, but as you say, the vast majority, yes, there's bottom up.
Any last comments?
Huge thanks for putting this on.
Thank you for you guys turning up.
Thank you to everybody. It's fascinating to hear the different link-ups and the different networks and how the project has meaning in so many different contexts and can solve so many different problems. And it is about provoking that model to get built and then to provoke the industry. You know, Chris and I are also going to be planning an event for late June, the 26th of June. I'll send out all the details via Eventbrite. And the focus of that event, again, is very much coming to the table with deep dive Q&As. Okay, so it's going to be very much majority time a deep dive Q&A on the project and your local and so on, you know, structural issues. So just bear that in mind. But the last two, this session and the previous session, have come at things from a slightly different angle. This is more focused in on the technical specifications and the monetary aspect. So there's plenty of material here just in terms of you continuing to share. The minute that you're on my mailing list, I invite you all to simply consistently forward those emails, that material, the link to the download, the link to the videos, and the link to the future Eventbrite, so that we can just continue to change the conversation. Yeah, that's what we have to do. We know we have to do that. Okay, thank you to everybody for coming.
And thank you, Nicola, for acting as IC, organising all of this up. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been really good.
Yeah,
thank you.
I've learnt a few things and had a few more ideas that I need to go and act on.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Lovely to meet everyone.
Thank you.